While I was having dinner at my son's house, my neighbor called me and asked in a trembling voice, "Are you home?" "No, I'm having dinner at my son's house." He whispered, "Then who is in your house right now?" My son laughed out loud. The scent of rosemary and roasted chicken clung to the warm air in the dining room, a comforting, familiar perfume that always signaled Sunday. Elara watched her son, Ben, as he stood at the head of the polished oak table, wielding the carving knife with a practiced ease that reminded her so acutely of his father. The late afternoon sun slanted through the large bay window, catching the fine dust motes dancing in the air and casting a halo around her granddaughter Lily's blonde hair. Lily, all of 6 years old, was meticulously arranging her peas into a perfect, green circle on her plate, her brow furrowed in concentration. "A little more for you, Mom?" Ben asked, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. He held up a slice of breast meat, glistening with juices, on the end of the carving fork. Elara smiled, a genuine, soul-deep smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Just a small piece, dear. Chloe's gravy is too good to waste, and I need room to mop it all up." Across the table her daughter-in-law Chloe laughed. "There's plenty more where that came from, Elara. Ben thinks my roast potatoes are the main event, but we all know it's the gravy that holds the universe together." This was her sanctuary. These Sunday dinners had become a ritual since Frank passed 3 years ago, a bulwark against the quiet that threatened to fill the corners of her small house. Here, surrounded by the gentle clatter of cutlery, the murmur of easy conversation, and the chaotic joy of her granddaughter, the silence was kept at bay. Here she wasn't a widow, she was a mother, a grandmother. Whole. Ben placed the slice of chicken on her plate with a flourish, his own smile mirroring hers. He had his father's eyes, kind and deep-set, but his smile was all his own, wide and infectious. At 35, he was everything she and Frank had hoped he would be. A good husband, a doting father, a successful architect whose designs were beginning to dot the city's skyline. A wave of pride, so fierce it was almost painful, washed over her. "So," Ben said, settling into his chair and unfolding his napkin, "tell me about your week. Did Mrs. Gable finally win her war against the squirrels?" Elara chuckled, cutting into a soft, fluffy potato. "Oh, it's an ongoing saga. She's bought some sort of high-frequency sound device now. She claims it repels them, but all I've noticed is that her prize-winning begonias are starting to wilt. I think she's just torturing her own flowers." The conversation flowed easily after that, weaving through Lily's latest art project at school, Chloe's upcoming presentation at the university where she taught literature, and Ben's frustrations with a city council permit. It was domestic and mundane and utterly perfect. Elara soaked it in, memorizing the way the light caught the crystal water glasses, the sound of Lily's giggles, the feeling of Ben's hand briefly covering hers as he reached for the salt. These were the moments she hoarded, the currency she used to buy her way through the long, quiet weekdays. It was during a lull, as Chloe was clearing the main course plates to make way for dessert, that Elara's phone, resting beside her water glass, began to vibrate. The harsh, buzzing sound was an intrusion, a dissonant note in the symphony of their evening. "Sorry," Elara murmured, glancing at the screen. The name displayed was Martha Gable. "It's just Martha. Probably wants an update on the squirrel offensive." Ben grinned. "Tell her to surrender with dignity." Elara picked up the phone, a smile still lingering on her lips. "Martha? Is everything all right?" Silence greeted her for a moment, punctuated only by a faint, staticky sound like wind whistling through a crack. Then her neighbor's voice came, not her usual booming, cheerful tone, but a frantic, papery whisper that was barely audible. "Elara? Are you home?" The question was so odd, so out of place that Elara frowned. "No, Martha, I told you this morning I was having dinner at Ben's house. Remember? You said to have a slice of apple pie for you." There was another pause, this one charged with a tension that made the fine hairs on Elara's arms stand on end. She could hear Martha's breathing now, shallow and ragged. The smile fell from Elara's face. Across the table, Chloe paused, a stack of plates in her hands, her expression shifting to one of concern. Ben stopped talking to Lily, his head tilted. "Martha, what is it? You sound frightened." The whisper came again, threaded with a strand of pure panic that coiled in Elara's stomach and squeezed hard. "Then who is in your house right now?" The words didn't compute at first. They were a jumble of sounds that made no sense in the warm, safe dining room. Alara's mind felt slow, thick, like it was wading through molasses. What? What are you talking about? The lights, Alara, Martha hissed, her voice trembling violently now. Your upstairs bedroom light. It just came on. I saw a shadow move past the window. I swear it. Someone is in your house. The fork slipped from Alara's suddenly numb fingers and clattered onto her plate. The sound was deafening in the suddenly silent room. The rich aroma of roast chicken turned acrid in her throat. Her house. Her small, brick house filled with Frank's books and her mother's china and 60 years of memories. An image flashed in her mind, unbidden and terrifyingly clear. A stranger's hands touching her things, walking on her floors, violating the sacred quiet of the space she shared with her husband's ghost. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Someone's in my house? She breathed, her voice a reedy echo of Martha's. Her eyes darted to Ben, wide with a terror that was blooming inside her with breathtaking speed. She expected to see her own fear reflected back at her. She expected him to be rising from his chair, his face a mask of concern, already reaching for his own phone to call the police. Chloe had set the plates down, her hand flying to her mouth. Lily looked from her grandmother's pale face to her father's, her lower lip beginning to tremble. But Ben wasn't moving. He was just looking at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. And then his face changed. The corners of his mouth twitched. A sound escaped his throat. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a gasp of shock. It was a laugh. It wasn't a small chuckle of disbelief. It was a loud, barking sound that filled the sudden, dreadful silence of the room. It was sharp and jarring and so completely, utterly wrong that it felt like a physical blow. He threw his head back and laughed, a full-throated laugh that seemed to shake his entire body. Alara stared at him, the phone still pressed to her ear, Martha's frantic whispers having faded into a meaningless buzz. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin feeling cold and tight. The image of a faceless intruder in her bedroom was suddenly, shockingly, replaced by the image of her own son, sitting at his dinner table, laughing at her terror. The world tilted, the warm, golden room seeming to dim and warp around her. She saw Chloe's look of stunned confusion, Lily's frightened tears, but all she could truly focus on was Ben, her son, laughing as her world cracked open. The echo of Ben's laughter faded, but the sound seemed to have solidified in the air, a grotesque monument to the moment everything had fractured. It hung between them, cold and heavy. Alara's hand, still clutching the phone, was trembling so badly she could barely hold it steady. On the other end, Martha's panicked voice had turned into a questioning squawk. Alara? Alara, did you hear me? What was that noise? Yes, Alara managed, her voice a dry whisper. Her gaze was locked on her son. We're on our way, Martha. Call the police. Please. She disconnected the call without waiting for a reply, her thumb moving mechanically. Ben's face had finally changed. The mirth drained away as he registered the profound shock on his mother's face, the horror dawning in Chloe's eyes, and the silent tears now streaming down Lily's cheeks. The jovial host was gone, replaced by a man scrambling to reverse a catastrophic mistake. Mom, wait, he said, his voice suddenly strained. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the wood floor. I'm sorry. I don't know why I did that. It just sounded so bizarre I thought it had to be a joke. Like one of Mark's stupid pranks from down the street. The excuse was a flimsy shield and her terror pierced right through it. A prank? A joke? The trembling in Martha's voice had been real, the primal fear of a neighbor watching a violation unfold. It was not a joke. The casual dismissal felt like a second betrayal, a layer of insulation he was wrapping around himself, leaving her out in the cold. I want to go home, Alara said, her voice low and tight. She stood up, her own chair making a soft, dissenting shuffle. The rich meal sat like a stone in her stomach. The warmth of the room now felt suffocating. Of course, Ben said, rushing to her side, his hands hovering near her elbows as if he were afraid to touch her. We'll go right now. Chloe, He glanced back at his wife, a helpless, pleading look on his face. Chloe was already moving, her own shock sublimated into action. She scooped a whimpering Lily out of her chair, murmuring soothing words against her hair. Her eyes met Elara's over their daughter's head, and in them, Elara saw not just concern but a deep, troubled confusion. Chloe didn't understand her husband's reaction any more than Elara did. That shared bewilderment was a tiny, cold comfort. "Go," Chloe said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Just call me as soon as you know what's happening. Be careful, both of you." The goodbye was a frantic, whispered affair. The perfect family dinner had disintegrated into chaos in under 2 minutes. Elara barely registered grabbing her coat and purse, her movements stiff and automatic. All she could think about was the light in her bedroom window, the shadow of a stranger moving through the most private space of her life, and the sound of her son's laughter. The 10-minute drive from Ben's sprawling new-build home to her modest post-war brick house had never felt so long. It was a journey through a landscape of fear, each familiar landmark twisted into something sinister. The car, usually a place of easy chatter, was now a vacuum of strained silence. The sleek leather seats felt cold, the polished dashboard gleaming with the reflected streetlights that smeared past the windows like distorted constellations. Ben drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white mountains on a pale ridge. He kept clearing his throat, the sound loud and abrasive in the quiet car. "Mom, I am so sorry," he began again, his voice carefully modulated, the voice he used for difficult clients. "That was an awful reaction. I was just so caught off guard. I'm sure it's nothing. You know how the wind can make the branches of that old oak tree scrape against the window. It can cast some funny shadows." Elara didn't answer. She stared out the passenger window, her reflection a ghostly, pale mask superimposed over the dark, rushing houses. A branch? Did he really think she, or Martha, was so foolish as to mistake a branch for a person? The rationalizations felt like pats on the head, condescending and infuriating. It wasn't calming her, it was making her feel utterly alone in her terror. "And Martha's eyesight isn't what it used to be," he pressed on, the silence clearly unnerving him. "Remember last month when she called the fire department because she thought Mr. Henderson's barbecue was a house fire?" "She sounded terrified, Ben," Elara said, her voice flat. She didn't turn to look at him. If she looked at him, she was afraid the hurt warring with her fear would spill out in a torrent of words they could never take back. That wasn't the sound of someone mistaking a shadow. That was panic. Okay, you're right," he conceded quickly, too quickly. "We'll get there, the police will check it out, and we'll find out it was a faulty wire or something that made the light flicker on. And we'll all have a laugh about it tomorrow." A laugh. The word was a slap. She flinched, a small, involuntary movement. He didn't seem to notice. He was a man trying to smooth over a problem, to manage a situation, to restore order. He wasn't sharing her fear, he was trying to erase it. Her mind spun, replaying the phone call, his reaction, his weak excuses. The laughter hadn't sounded surprised or shocked. It had sounded something else. Hysterical, perhaps. Or dismissive. Or worse, knowing. A cold slick of dread, entirely separate from the thought of a burglar, slid down her spine. Why would her son, her loving, protective son, react with anything but immediate, fierce concern? It was a tear in the fabric of the reality she had so carefully woven around herself. He had always been her rock since Frank died. Now the rock itself seemed to be crumbling into sand. She clutched the handle of her purse, the worn leather a familiar comfort against her sweating palm. Inside was her key ring. The key to her front door. The key that was supposed to keep the world out. The thought that someone was inside, bypassing that simple lock, made her feel physically ill. Frank had installed that deadbolt himself a month after they moved in, his proud handiwork. The violation felt like a desecration of his memory, too. "We're almost there," Ben said, his voice softer now, as if sensing his previous tactics had failed. He reached over and briefly touched her shoulder. His touch was warm, but it did nothing to quell the chill inside her. As they turned the final corner onto her quiet, tree-lined street, the world dissolved into strobing flashes of red and blue. The lights were hypnotic and nauseating, painting the familiar facades of her neighbors' houses in ghastly, pulsating colors. One police cruiser was parked directly in front of her walkway. Its silent, rhythmic flashing was a beacon of her realized fears. It was real. Martha hadn't been mistaken. There was a reason for police to be at her house. Ben swore under his breath, a sharp, guttural sound. He slowed the car, pulling up 20 feet behind the cruiser. The air in the car shifted. His forced calm finally evaporated, replaced by a tense, palpable apprehension. Elara unbuckled her seatbelt before the car had even come to a complete stop. The drive had been a suspended state of dread, but now, faced with the stark reality of the flashing lights on her home, a desperate urgency took over. She pushed the door open, her legs feeling unsteady as they met the solid pavement. The cool night air was a shock to her system. "Mom, wait for me," Ben called, but she was already moving. A uniformed officer, young enough to be her grandson, was standing on the edge of her lawn, talking into his shoulder radio. He turned as she approached, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. Behind her, she heard Ben's car door slam shut. She heard his footsteps hurrying to catch up. But she didn't turn around. Her focus was singular, narrowed to the front door of her little brick house, which stood closed and silent beyond the officer. The upstairs bedroom window was dark now, a black, unblinking eye. But she knew. She knew something was wrong. The longest mile was over, but as she stood there, trembling on the precipice of the unknown, she had the terrible feeling that the far more difficult journey was just about to begin. The young officer, whose name tag read Riley, approached them with a calm, measured stride that seemed at odds with the frantic pulsing of the emergency lights. He had a kind face, but his eyes were professionally distant, assessing her, then Ben, in a single, sweeping glance. "Ma'am, are you Elara Vance?" he asked, his voice even. "Yes, I am," she said, her own voice thin and reedy. She had to resist the urge to wrap her arms around herself. Ben stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on her back. The gesture felt more proprietary than protective. "I'm her son, Ben. My mother just got a call from her neighbor." "What's the situation, officer?" He projected an aura of calm authority, the capable man taking charge. "We received a call from a Martha Gable reporting a possible intruder at this address," Officer Riley explained, his gaze shifting back to Elara. "We've performed a full perimeter check of the property. All windows and doors are secure. There are no signs of forced entry. From the outside, the house is locked up tight." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they landed with a dull thud in Elara's gut. No signs of forced entry. That meant either Martha was wrong or the person who was inside had a key. The second possibility was so monstrous she immediately pushed it away, a snake recoiling in her mind. "My neighbor saw someone," Elara insisted, the words tumbling out. "In my bedroom window." "We'll need to go inside and do a sweep to be certain, ma'am," the officer said patiently. His partner, a stout, older man, was now walking toward them from the other side of the cruiser. "Do you have your key?" Elara's hand trembled as she fumbled in her purse. The familiar weight of the key ring felt alien. Finding the right key, the one she could locate in the dark by feel alone, suddenly took immense concentration. The simple act of handing it over to this stranger felt like a profound surrender. Officer Riley took the key. "My partner and I will clear the house. It's standard procedure. We'd appreciate it if you'd both wait out here." "No," Elara said, the word sharper than she intended. "It's my home. I'm going in." The officer hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "All right. But please stay with me in the living room until we've cleared the entire residence." The click of the lock turning was unnaturally loud. The door swung inward, opening not into her familiar, comforting hallway, but into a space charged with menace. The air inside was still and cool, carrying the faint, pleasant scent of the lemon oil she used on the furniture, but it was now tainted by the sharp, unfamiliar smell of the officers' tactical vests and the metallic tang of Elara's own fear. She stepped over the threshold, Ben close behind her. She stood rigidly in the center of her living room, her eyes darting everywhere. The two officers moved with a quiet, efficient grace, one heading down the hall toward the kitchen while Riley started up the stairs, his footsteps soft on the runner her mother had hooked decades ago. Ben let out a long, slow breath. "See, Mom? Everything looks exactly the same. Nothing's been touched." He gestured vaguely at the tidy room, the plumped-up cushions on the sofa, the neat stack of magazines on the coffee table. But his words were just noise. Elara's senses were on high alert, cataloging her surroundings with a frantic intensity. It was her home, but it felt like a perfect replica, a museum exhibit of her life where one tiny, crucial detail was wrong. Her gaze fell on the end table beside her favorite armchair. Her copy of Middlemarch was lying there. But it was face down, the spine arched back, the page creased. A cold knot formed in her stomach. She never did that. It was a sacrilege to treat a book that way. Her silver bookmark, a gift from Frank on their 20th anniversary, was lying on the table beside it. Her head snapped up as Officer Riley's footsteps sounded on the stairs again. He descended with an air of finality. "The house is clear, ma'am," he announced. "We checked every room, every closet. There's no one here. Nothing appears to be disturbed." His partner returned from the kitchen with a similar report. "All clear. Back door is bolted, windows are locked." "But my book," Elara whispered, pointing with a trembling finger. Officer Riley glanced at the book, his expression unchanged. "Ma'am, I didn't leave it like that. I used the bookmark. I would never leave a book face down." Ben stepped in, his voice placating. "Mom, you were probably just tired when you put it down last night. It's an easy mistake to make." The officer gave a sympathetic, but clearly dismissive, nod. "It's very common in these situations. Adrenaline can affect your memory, make you question little things. We get a call like this, 9 times out of 10 it's a reflection from a passing car or, like your son said, a tree branch. Your neighbor was just being cautious, which is a good thing." They were a united front of calm, masculine reason against her burgeoning female hysteria. She felt her reality being gently, politely, and firmly denied. The evidence of her own senses, the intimate knowledge of her own habits, was being dismissed as a trick of the mind. "I'd like to check the kitchen," she said, her voice stiff. She walked past them, her heart hammering. In the kitchen, the fluorescent light hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the clean countertops. Everything appeared normal. The dish towel was folded over the oven handle. The mail was in a neat pile on the corner counter. And then she saw it. Sitting next to the sink was a single teacup from her Royal Albert collection, the delicate, rose-patterned china she used only on special occasions. It was Frank's favorite. She had used it that morning for her tea, washed it carefully by hand, and placed it upside down on the right side of the drying rack to air dry. She remembered the specific action distinctly. Now it was sitting upright on the counter, perfectly dry. "This cup," she said, her voice shaking as Ben and the officers appeared in the doorway. "I left it in the drying rack." "I know I did." Ben sighed, a sound of strained patience. "Mom, please. You're getting worked up over nothing. Does it really matter where the teacup is?" "It matters because I didn't put it there," she insisted, her voice rising with a desperate edge. "Don't you understand? Someone was in here. They were touching my things." Officer Riley cleared his throat. "Ma'am, with all due respect, there is no evidence of an intruder. The house is secure. Nothing has been taken. We're going to file this as an unfounded call." He handed her key back to her. "If it would make you feel safer, we can have a patrol car drive by a few extra times tonight." The offer was a useless platitude. The danger she felt wasn't something a passing car could fix. It was an invisible poison that had seeped into the very walls of her home. They left a few minutes later, their departure as quiet and efficient as their arrival. The flashing lights vanished, and the sudden, profound darkness that fell over the street was a shock. The house was plunged back into its ordinary silence, but the silence was different now. It was heavier, watchful. Ben let out a huge sigh of relief, slumping against the door jamb. "Well, thank God that's over. What a scare. You see, Mom? All that worry for nothing." His relief felt like a physical blow. It was over for him. For her, it was just beginning. "I think you should go home, Ben," she said, turning away from him to look at the teacup, her silent, porcelain witness. "What?" "Mom, I can't leave you alone now. I should stay the night." "No," she said firmly, cutting him off. "I need to be alone." She needed space from his suffocating, dismissive reassurances. She needed to breathe air that wasn't thick with his certainty that she was wrong. He looked hurt, but he didn't argue. He gave her a clumsy one-armed hug, kissed the top of her head, and promised to call in the morning. Elara walked him to the door, watched him get into his car, and waited until his taillights disappeared around the corner. Then she locked the door, engaging the deadbolt Frank had installed. The solid thunk of the bolt sliding into place offered no comfort. She was alone now in her safe, secure house. But as she stood in the silent hallway, her entire being thrummed with the terrifying certainty that the echoes of an unwelcome presence lingered in the shadows, and that for the first time in her life she could not trust her own son. The 2 days that followed were lived in a state of suspended animation. Elara went through the motions of her life, watering her plants, sorting the mail, preparing simple meals she had no appetite for, but a part of her was always listening, waiting. The familiar groans and sighs of her old house, once a source of comfort, had become a language of threats. The shudder of the water heater kicking on in the basement was the sound of a footstep. The rustle of leaves against the windowpane was the scratching of fingers seeking a way in. Her home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a listening post, and she was its lone, sleepless sentinel. She took to checking the locks 3, 4, 5 times before bed, her hand tracing the cool brass of the deadbolt as if it were a talisman. During the day, she found herself lingering by the windows, peering through the lace curtains at the quiet street, her heart giving a nervous leap every time a car slowed down or a delivery truck rumbled past. The feeling of being watched was a constant, clammy presence at the back of her neck. The out-of-place teacup and the mishandled book had become obsessive focal points in her mind, small, solid facts in a sea of terrifying uncertainty. They were her proof that she was not forgetful, not hysterical. She was a witness. Ben called on Tuesday evening, his voice booming with a manufactured cheerfulness that grated on her raw nerves. "Hey, Mom. Just checking in. How are things?" "I'm fine, Ben," she said, her voice a flat monotone. She was sitting in her armchair, the copy of Middlemarch resting closed in her lap. "Good, good. See? I told you it was just a false alarm. Probably just Martha getting spooked by her own shadow," he chuckled. The sound was horribly reminiscent of his laugh at the dinner table. Elara's grip tightened on the arms of her chair. "Martha was trying to help, dear." An awkward silence stretched between them. She could almost hear him recalibrating, switching tactics. "Right, of course. She's a great neighbor. So, listen, Chloe was thinking we could all go out for brunch on Saturday. That new place by the park. What do you think?" He was trying to build a bridge back to normalcy, to pave over the crack in their relationship with talk of eggs Benedict and family outings. A week ago she would have been delighted. Now, the invitation felt like a summons to a play in which she no longer knew her lines. An idea cold and sharp surfaced in her mind. "That sounds nice," she said, letting her voice soften slightly. "How are things at the firm?" "Still busy." There was a fractional pause. "Oh, you know," he said, his voice a little too breezy. "Always. Swamped. We're trying to land that big downtown library contract, so it's all hands on deck." "The library?" she said. "That's wonderful. Frank would have been so proud of you, working on a project like that." "Yeah, well, it's not in the bag yet," he said quickly. "It's a long shot, to be honest. Listen, I've got to run, another call coming in. I'll talk to you tomorrow, okay? Love you." He hung up before she could say anything else. Elara slowly lowered the phone, a cold disquiet settling over her. He'd seemed evasive. A long shot? For months, he had spoken of the library project as if it were practically his, a career-defining achievement. Now he was downplaying it. It was a small thing, a subtle shift in tone, but like the teacup on the counter, it felt wrong. The next afternoon, unable to settle, she found herself in Frank's old study. The room was much as he had left it, lined with books on history and architecture. She ran her hand along the dusty spines, the scent of old paper and leather filling her senses. This room had always been the quiet heart of their home, a place of thought and reason. Now, she had come here seeking answers, though she didn't even know the questions. She sat down at his heavy oak desk and opened the bottom drawer, the one filled with old, unorganized photo albums. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. A clue. A sign. An echo from the past that might explain the dissonant note of the present. She pulled out a thick, velvet-covered album and opened it on her lap. There were pictures of Ben's childhood, Ben on his first bicycle, a gap-toothed grin on his face, Ben at the beach, proudly holding up a piece of sea glass, Ben at his high school graduation, looking awkward and impossibly young in his cap and gown. In every photo, she saw the boy she knew, the open, honest face of her son. She kept turning the pages, moving into his college years. And then she saw it. It was a candid snapshot, slightly blurry, taken at an outdoor party. Ben was in a group of friends, a red plastic cup in his hand. He was laughing, but it was the wrong kind of laugh. It wasn't the joyful, infectious smile of her other pictures. It was wide and tight, a look of almost manic energy in his eyes, a frantic hilarity that didn't quite reach them. It was the same look he'd had at the dinner table. A look of someone trying desperately to pretend everything was fine when it was anything but. The photograph acted as a key, unlocking a memory she had long since buried. Ben's sophomore year of college. There had been trouble. Vague, ill-defined trouble that Frank had handled. There were whispers of gambling, of debts to the wrong kind of people. Frank had driven to Ben's university, spent a weekend there, and returned looking 10 years older. "It's handled," he had told her, his voice weary. "He fell in with a bad crowd. Made some stupid mistakes. It's over now." She had accepted it because she'd wanted to. Because Frank was her rock and he had promised her it was fixed. They had never spoken of it again. They had let the incident be smoothed over by time and subsequent successes, a small, forgotten pothole on Ben's road to a good life. But now, sitting in the silent study, the memory returned with terrifying clarity. She remembered the hushed, tense phone calls between Frank and Ben. She remembered Ben coming home for Christmas that year, thinner and quieter, avoiding her eyes. He had been hiding something then, and his father had helped him. Frank hadn't been protecting Ben from the consequences, he had been protecting her from the truth. Ilara's hands trembled as she stared at the photograph. The stranger in the picture was the same stranger who had sat at her son's dinner table. The past was not dead, it wasn't even past. It was whispering to her from the glossy surface of a 20-year-old photograph, telling her that the son she thought she knew was an expertly crafted fiction. The fear of the intruder, the nameless, faceless man in her bedroom, began to recede. In its place, a far more profound and intimate dread took root. The danger wasn't from a stranger who had violated her home. The danger was her son, the secrets he was keeping, and the desperate measures he might be willing to take to keep them hidden. Her quest was no longer about securing her house. It was about uncovering the truth of the man she had raised. The weekend arrived, and with it, Ben's proposed brunch. He called Saturday morning, his voice once again carefully cheerful, as if their last strained conversation had never happened. Ilara declined. She claimed a headache, a plausible excuse that was not entirely a lie. A dull, persistent ache had taken up residence behind her eyes, a physical manifestation of the tension that now permeated her life. The truth was, the thought of sitting across a table from him, making small talk while this chasm of unspoken suspicion widened between them, was unbearable. Her refusal was met with a flicker of annoyance in his voice, quickly masked. "All right, Mom. Well, rest up. We'll try for next week." He didn't push, and his easy acceptance was, in its own way, more unsettling than an argument would have been. It felt like he was glad to be let off the hook. That afternoon, a cold, persistent rain began to fall, sheeting against the windows and making the world outside a gray, watery blur. The weather matched her mood. Trapped inside, the house felt smaller, the walls closer. She decided to tackle a task she'd been putting off for months, sorting through the winter clothes in her bedroom closet. It was a mundane chore, a way to impose order on at least one small corner of her chaotic inner world. The closet was deep, filled with the scents of cedar and thyme. His side, Frank's side, remained largely untouched, a neat row of suits and pressed shirts she couldn't yet bring herself to give away. Her side was more cluttered. She reached to the top shelf, pulling down a stack of woolen sweaters. As she did, her hand brushed against the corner of a familiar object tucked away in the back, behind a stack of old hat boxes. It was a small, rectangular box made of polished walnut, inlaid with a mother-of-pearl initial, E. Frank had made it for her on their first anniversary. It wasn't a jewelry box, it was a memory box. Inside, it held his most treasured letters, the ones he'd written her during the first year of their marriage when his work as a young engineer had often taken him out of town. A sudden, icy premonition washed over her. It was an impulse she couldn't explain, a cold dread that started in her stomach and spread through her limbs. She pulled the box down. It was heavier than she remembered. She ran her fingers over the smooth, cool wood. She knew its position on the shelf as intimately as she knew the lines on her own hands. It was always pushed flush against the back wall. Now it was a good inch forward. Her breath caught in her throat. "You're being foolish," a rational part of her mind insisted. "You probably moved it yourself and forgot." But she knew she hadn't. With trembling hands she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded blue velvet, was the small stack of letters, tied with a pale pink silk ribbon. She and Frank had a running joke about her specific, meticulous bow tying. She always made a double loop with the left tail. It was a silly, intimate habit, a signature. The ribbon was tied in a knot. A simple, clumsy, single-looped knot. The sight was a physical blow. The air left her lungs in a whoosh, and for a moment the world tilted, the floor seeming to drop away beneath her. Someone had been in this box. Someone had untied her ribbon, touched his letters, and then tied it back up again, ineptly. This wasn't a misplaced teacup. This wasn't a forgotten bookmark. This was a desecration. A stranger had put their hands on the most sacred artifact of her marriage, on the physical remnants of her husband's love. A hot, clarifying rage burned through her fear. This was not the work of a random thief. A burglar would have tossed the box aside, looking for jewelry or cash. This was something else. This was a search. She didn't hesitate. She walked on unsteady legs into the living room, the box held in her hands like a holy relic, and picked up the phone. She dialed Ben's number. When he answered, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need you to come over. Now." Her voice was low and shaking with a cold fury. "Mom? What's wrong? You sound upset. Is it your headache? Just come, Ben. It's important." She hung up and placed the walnut box squarely in the center of the coffee table. She untied the clumsy knot and laid the letters beside it, fanning them out slightly. Then she sat in her armchair, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. He arrived 20 minutes later, his hair damp from the rain, his expression a mixture of concern and impatience. "Mom, you had me worried. What's going on?" She didn't stand up. She simply tilted her head toward the coffee table. "Do you see this box?" Ben's eyes followed her gesture. He frowned. "It's Dad's old box. The one he made you. What about it?" "Someone has been in it," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "Someone went into my closet, took it from its hiding place, went through Frank's letters, and then tied the ribbon back up with a different knot." Ben stared at the box, then back at her. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes before his face settled into a mask of weary frustration. "Oh, for God's sake, Mom. Not this again. I was in the middle of a meeting." "This has nothing to do with a meeting and everything to do with the truth," she said, her calm beginning to fray. "The teacup. The book. Now this. This is undeniable proof that someone was in my house. Someone who wasn't looking for money. Or," he said, his voice rising, "or you looked at the letters yourself a few days ago and forgot. You retied it and didn't even realize." "I have not opened that box in over a year, Ben," she snapped. "And I have tied that ribbon the same way for 40 years. That is not my knot." He threw his hands up in exasperation, pacing the small space in front of the fireplace. "I can't believe this. I cannot believe you dragged me all the way over here in the pouring rain to talk about a ribbon. You're obsessing. This isn't healthy." Then he stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression softening into one of pity, a look that was 1,000 times more infuriating than his anger. "Mom," he said, his voice dropping to a low, reasonable tone. "Listen to me. You've been under a lot of stress since Dad died. And this scare with the neighbor has obviously rattled you. People's memories get fuzzy when they're upset. Things get confused. Maybe it's time you had a chat with Dr. Evans. Just to talk things through." The words struck her with the force of a physical slap. Dr. Evans was their family doctor, a kind man who had treated her for the flu and Frank for his blood pressure. Ben was suggesting she needed a psychological evaluation. He was telling her she was losing her mind. He was using her grief as a weapon, twisting her love for his father into evidence of her own senility. A great yawning chasm opened up in the floor between them. On one side was her son, her brilliant, successful son, looking at her with concern that felt like condescension. On the other was her, a grieving widow, a frightened homeowner, a mother whose reality was being systematically dismantled by the person she trusted most. "Get out," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "What?" He looked genuinely shocked. "Get out." Of my house. His face hardened then, the feigned concern dissolving into raw, defensive anger. Fine, he spat. Fine. I'm trying to help you and this is what I get. You know what? Call me when you're ready to be rational. He turned and stormed out, slamming the front door behind him. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, a final violent severing. Elara didn't move. She sat in her armchair, staring at the precious letters and the desecrated ribbon. The rain beat a relentless rhythm against the window panes. He had not confessed. He had done something worse. He had tried to make her believe she was crazy. But his anger, his cruel, calculated attempt to make her doubt her own sanity had failed. An innocent son, faced with his mother's genuine distress, would have offered comfort, promised to install a security system, or at the very least listened. A guilty son would get angry. A guilty son would try to convince the sole witness that she couldn't trust her own mind. She knew now, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as granite, that he was lying. And if he wouldn't tell her the truth, there was only one other person who had seen something that night. Her next stop was not the doctor's office. It was Martha Gable's house. The morning after the storm broke clear and bright, the world washed clean. Sunlight, sharper than usual, streamed through Elara's living room window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and glinting off the walnut box still sitting on her coffee table. The sight of it, a beautiful thing now tainted by deceit, sent a fresh pang of heartache through her. She had barely slept, her mind a frantic carousel of images. Ben's furious, defensive face, the clumsy knot on the silk ribbon, the ghost of her husband's handwriting on the letters. The argument had stripped away the last vestiges of her denial. Her fear and confusion had coalesced into a cold, hard certainty. But certainty was a lonely, bitter thing without proof. Ben had built a fortress of rationalizations and accusations around himself, and her intimate knowledge of her own home was not enough to breach the walls. She needed something more. She needed an outside witness. From her window she could see Martha Gable's house next door. Smoke curled from the chimney, a sign that Martha was up and had the kettle on. For nearly a week, Elara had avoided her, embarrassed by the official verdict of a false alarm and unwilling to discuss Ben's dismissal of the whole affair. But now Martha's home was not just the house next door, it was an observation post. Martha was her only ally, even if she didn't know it yet. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Elara put on her coat. She didn't bother with a scarf or gloves. She walked out her front door, down the 3 steps to the stone path, and turned onto the stretch of damp lawn that separated their 2 properties. It was a journey of less than 50 feet, a path she had crossed thousands of times to borrow a cup of sugar or deliver a slice of cake. Today, each step felt heavy and deliberate, a pilgrimage toward a truth she was terrified to find. Martha answered the door on the second knock, wiping her hands on a floral apron. Her face, usually wreathed in a cheerful, bustling energy, was etched with concern when she saw Elara. "Elara, dear. I was so worried. I saw Ben's car leave in such a state last night, and the door slammed so loudly. Is everything all right? Can I come in for a moment, Martha?" Elara asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Of course, you silly thing, get in out of this chill." Martha's living room was the complete opposite of her own. Where Elara's home was now a place of tense, minimalist order, Martha's was a riot of comfortable, lived-in clutter. Crocheted blankets were draped over floral armchairs, shelves overflowed with books and knickknacks, and every available surface held a framed photograph of a beaming grandchild. A large marmalade cat blinked sleepily at Elara from its perch on a sun-drenched cushion. "Tea?" Martha asked, already bustling toward the kitchen. "Please," Elara said, sinking into one of the soft armchairs. She waited until Martha returned with 2 steaming mugs, placing them on coasters on the cluttered coffee table. "Now," Martha said, settling opposite her, her kind eyes full of worry. "Tell me what's wrong. It's about that night, isn't it?" Elara nodded, wrapping her cold hands around the warm mug. "Martha, the police said you were mistaken. And Ben, he agrees with them. He thinks I'm getting forgetful, that I'm imagining things." Martha bristled with indignation. "Imagining things? Elara, I'm 74, not blind. I know what I saw. I saw a light and I saw a shape move in front of it. Clear as day." "I believe you," Elara said, and the relief that washed over Martha's face was palpable. "My house, things were moved. Small things nobody else would notice, but I do. I know someone was in there. That's why I'm here. I need you to tell me again. Everything you saw. From the very beginning. Please don't leave anything out, no matter how small or silly it might seem. Martha leaned forward, her voice dropping conspiratorially. All right. I was in my kitchen finishing the washing up. I looked out the window over at your house like I always do. It was dark, of course. And then, pop. The light in your upstairs bedroom just came on. It gave me such a fright. I stood there for a second, my heart going like a jackhammer, telling myself it was just a reflection, but then I saw the shadow. It moved right past the window from left to right. A silhouette. What kind of silhouette? Elara pressed, leaning forward. Can you describe it? Martha frowned in concentration. It all happened so fast, dear. It was man-sized, I suppose. Not terribly big, not terribly small. Just a shape, really. I'm sorry, I wish I could tell you more. A wave of disappointment washed over Elara. A shape. It was nothing. Nothing she could use. She was about to thank Martha and leave, her last hope extinguished, when she remembered her own line of questioning. Don't leave anything out. Was there anything else, Martha? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. Before you saw the light. Anything at all? A noise? A car? Martha's eyes widened. She put her teacup down with a clatter. Oh my goodness, she breathed. The car. I didn't even think to tell the police. It seemed like nothing at the time. I didn't want to get some innocent person in trouble for just parking on the street. Elara's heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. What car, Martha? Well, a few minutes before the light came on, a car pulled up. It didn't park in front of your house, but further down past your driveway under the big maple tree. It just sat there for a minute and then the headlights went out. I only noticed because my neighbor's cat ran out and the lights caught its eyes. What did it look like? Elara asked, her throat suddenly dry. Oh, it was one of those dark sedans, you know? A deep blue, I think, or maybe black. It was very sleek, Martha said, gesturing with her hands. One of those nice ones. Alexis. I only know because my son-in-law has one just like it. It even had one of those university alumni stickers on the back window. A big M for the state university. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. A dark blue Lexus sedan. A state university alumni sticker on the back window. It was a perfect, irrefutable description of her son's car. The cozy, cluttered room seemed to recede, the cheerful chatter of Martha's budgie fading into a dull roar in Elara's ears. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a random burglar. It was Ben. He had parked down the street, snuck into her house, and moved through her bedroom. He had been there, in the dark, while she was at his home, eating his food, admiring his perfect life. The laughter, the dismissal, the accusations of senility. It was all a lie, a frantic, desperate performance to cover his tracks. She somehow managed to compose herself, to thank Martha with a calm she did not feel, her mind a maelstrom of betrayal and pain. She declined a second cup of tea and walked back across the lawn, her legs moving stiffly, mechanically. She stepped inside her own house, the familiar space now feeling like a stage set for a terrible play. She locked the deadbolt and leaned her back against the cool wood of the door, her eyes closed. The view from next door had given her the final devastating piece of the puzzle. The question was no longer who had been in her house, or even if anyone had. She had the what, the where, the when, and the who. All that was left was the one thing that mattered most, the one thing that would break her heart completely. Why? Elara spent Saturday in a state of cold, quiet preparation. She cleaned her house with a meticulous, almost reverent slowness, as if preparing it for a wake. She polished the silver, dusted the bookshelves, and vacuumed the rugs until the lines were perfectly straight. Each mundane task was an anchor, keeping her from being swept away by the roiling sea of her emotions. Late in the afternoon she called Ben. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and steady, a carefully constructed facade over a core of shattered stone. Ben, she said, I was hoping you could come for dinner tomorrow night. Just the two of us. I think we need to talk. There was a pause on the other end, and she could picture his expression perfectly, surprise followed by relief. He would think she had come to her senses, that his cruel diagnosis of her mental state had shocked her back into the reality he had constructed. "Of course, Mom," he said, his voice warm with what she now knew was condescension. "I'd love that. I'm so glad you called." 7 o'clock. 7 is fine, she said and hung up. On Sunday evening she set the dining room table for two. A simple white cloth, her everyday china, a single candle in the center. It was a Spartan, almost funereal setting. In the living room, on the polished surface of the coffee table, she once again placed the walnut box. This time she left the lid open, the clumsily knotted ribbon and the stack of Frank's letters clearly visible. It was not an accusation, it was a statement of fact. When the doorbell rang at precisely 7, her heart gave a single, painful thud, then settled. She opened the door. Ben stood on the porch, holding a bouquet of yellow tulips, her favorite. The gesture was so perfectly pitched, so deeply embedded in their shared history of affection, that it felt like the most profound lie of all. "These are for you," he said, smiling his wide, easy smile. He looked handsome and relaxed, the perfect son coming to make peace with his aging, confused mother. "Thank you, Ben," she said, taking the flowers. She didn't smile back. She led him into the living room. He saw the box immediately. His smile faltered, a flicker of irritation crossing his face before being replaced by a look of practiced patience. He put his briefcase down by the door. "Mom," he began, his voice soft and placating. "I'm so glad we're talking. I've been so worried. I think we both said some things we didn't mean the other day." Elara turned from placing the tulips in a vase, her hands steady. "I meant every word," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, she saw past the handsome face and the successful architect to the frantic, frightened stranger underneath. "I know someone was in this house last Sunday," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I know they went through my things. I know they opened that box. And now I know it was you." Ben flinched as if she'd struck him. He opened his mouth to issue a denial, but she held up a hand, silencing him. "I spoke to Martha Gable again," she continued, her voice a relentless, level monotone. "She was very clear. She gets a little confused about begonias, but her memory is perfect when it comes to cars. She told me about the one she saw parked down the street, right before the light came on in my bedroom. A dark blue Lexus sedan. She even remembered the university alumni sticker on the back window." She stopped. She didn't need to say another word. She simply stood there, holding his gaze, letting the terrible, irrefutable fact of it fill the space between them. The transformation was shocking. The confident man who had walked in moments before seemed to deflate, to collapse in on himself. The color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, grayish white. His practiced smile was gone, his mouth hanging slightly open. The denial he was about to voice died on his lips, replaced by a choked, rasping sound. She couldn't have," he stammered, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. "She did, Ben," Elara said. There was no triumph in her voice, only a vast, aching sorrow. That was what finally broke him. He stumbled back, sinking into the armchair opposite hers as if his legs could no longer hold him. He buried his face in his hands, and a terrible, ragged sob tore through the silence of the room. It was the sound of a lifetime of pretense shattering into a million pieces. When he finally looked up, his face was wrecked with tears, his eyes red and swollen. He was no longer her successful son, he was a terrified little boy. "I lost my job, Mom," he whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush of shame. 6 months ago. The firm, they had massive layoffs. The library project was my last hope, and they cut me before we even put in the final bid. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't tell Chloe. I couldn't bear to tell you." He was weeping freely now, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. "I've been pretending. Getting up every morning, putting on my suit, driving around all day just so Chloe wouldn't know. I burned through all our savings. I maxed out the credit cards. I took out a loan, a bad one. We're going to lose the house. We're going to lose everything." Elara listened, her heart clenching with each word. The puzzle pieces were slotting into place, forming a picture of desperation so profound it took her breath away. "Dad," Ben choked out. "He used to talk about bearer bonds. From his grandfather. He said he'd hidden them somewhere in the house for a real rainy day. I just thought if I could find them I could fix it. I could fix everything without anyone knowing. I wanted to protect you all. I didn't want to be a failure. He looked at the open box on the table, a new wave of shame washing over him. I was in your closet. I thought maybe he'd tucked them in there. I saw the box and I checked. That's all. I was just looking. And then he looked her straight in the eye, the source of his hysteria from that night finally laid bare. And then you called. From my house. From my perfect dinner party. You were so proud of me. And I was standing here in the dark robbing you. The whole world it just broke. I didn't know what to do, so I laughed. It was all I could do. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and ugly and utterly devastating. The silence that followed was broken only by his ragged breaths. Elara looked at the weeping man in the armchair, the son she had raised, and felt a storm of emotions. A surge of pity for his pathetic desperation, a tremor of anger at the mountain of lies, and beneath it all, a deep tectonic grief for the man she thought he was. The man in the mirror, the reflection of his father he had tried so desperately to be, had finally shattered. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely a whisper, heavy with the weight of the wreckage around them. You didn't do this to protect me, Ben, she said, a single, hot tear finally tracing a path down her own cheek. You did it to protect your pride. The confession, once unleashed, seemed to suck all the air out of the room. It left a vacuum in its wake, a hollow space filled only by the sound of Ben's ragged, hitching breaths. He sat slumped in the armchair, a stranger wearing her son's face, his carefully constructed world lying in ruins around him. The yellow tulips he had brought sat in their vase on the sideboard, their cheerful color a mocking counterpoint to the gray devastation that had settled over the evening. Elara looked at him, at this man who was both her child and a stranger, and felt a profound weariness seep into her bones. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind only the cold, heavy ash of sorrow. For 6 months, he had been living a double life, a performance of success and stability that must have been utterly exhausting. And in his desperation, he had made her home a stage for the final frantic act of his deception. Ben finally lifted his head, his tear-streaked face a mask of shame and exhaustion. He looked at her with the pleading eyes of a lost child, waiting for a verdict, for condemnation or perhaps, impossibly, for a solution. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what to do." He had abdicated. The capable son, the man who took charge, was gone. In his place was the boy who had made a terrible mistake and had come home, finally, to confess. But the path to confession had been littered with cruelty and lies. Elara's first thought was not for the money or the house or even for herself. It was for the other woman he had been deceiving every single day. "Chloe," Elara said, her voice flat. "Does she know any of this?" Ben flinched, and a fresh wave of shame washed over his face. He shook his head, unable to meet her gaze. "No. I couldn't. I didn't want her to worry. I thought I could fix it before she ever had to know." The words, meant to sound noble, landed as just another layer of betrayal. He had made his wife an unwitting accomplice in a fiction, denying her the right to be his partner in hardship. He had isolated himself on an island of his own pride. "There can be no more lies, Ben," Elara said, and her voice, though quiet, held a core of unyielding steel. This was the new ground on which they stood. "That is the first thing you have to do. Not tomorrow. Tonight. You will go home and you will tell your wife the truth. All of it." It was not a suggestion. It was a command. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a fresh terror at the prospect, but he simply nodded, accepting his penance. A bitter, practical question surfaced in Elara's mind. "The bonds you were looking for," she said. "Did you find them?" He gave a short, mirthless shake of his head. "No. I looked everywhere I could think of. The study, the attic, all of Dad's old hiding places." His desperate, violating search had been for nothing. Elara felt a wave of pity so sharp it was almost painful. She looked at the portrait of her late husband on the mantelpiece, his kind eyes smiling down on the wreckage of their son's life. "That's because there are no bonds, Ben," she said softly. He looked up, his expression utterly bewildered. "What?" Your father cashed them in nearly 10 years ago, she said, the memory returning with a bittersweet clarity. He didn't tell you because he didn't want to spoil the surprise. He used the money to help you. It was most of the down payment on the house you and Chloe bought. The final tragic irony of it all landed in the silent room with a crushing weight. He had been tearing apart his mother's home in a desperate search for something that had been given to him freely, lovingly years ago. The very foundation of the life he was trying to protect was built upon the thing he was convinced could save it. He stared at her, his mouth agape, as the sheer, heartbreaking futility of his actions washed over him. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was a choked whisper. What do we do? We are not going to do anything tonight, Elara corrected him gently but firmly. You are going to go home and tell the truth to your wife. The money, the house, those are problems that can be solved. We will solve them as a family. But that can only happen after the lies have stopped. She stood up, a signal that the evening was over. Ben rose slowly, his movements heavy, as if he were wading through water. He looked around the room, at the life he had so carelessly damaged, at the mother whose trust he had shattered. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. Mom, he began, but the words wouldn't come. What was there to say? Elara looked at him, at the immense, painful road that stretched before him, and before them all. Forgiveness was a distant country she couldn't yet see. Go home, Ben, she said, her voice softening with a weary maternal ache that even this betrayal could not extinguish. Go tell your wife the truth. He nodded and left, closing the door softly behind him. She listened to his car start and drive away, the sound fading into the Sunday night quiet. Elara stood alone in her hallway. The intruder was gone. The mystery was solved. But her house, her sanctuary, felt irrevocably altered. The silence that descended was not the menacing, watchful silence of the past week. Nor was it the peaceful, comforting silence she had known before. It was a new kind of silence, hollow, echoing, and profoundly sad. She walked into the living room and gently closed the lid of the walnut box, covering the letters. Her gaze fell on the yellow tulips, already beginning to wilt slightly under the warmth of the lamp. She touched a soft petal, a last, lingering remnant of a life that was no longer real. The lock on her front door was secure once more, but a far more important lock, the one on her heart, on her trust in the person she loved most in the world, had been broken. And as she stood alone in the quiet center of her life, she knew that finding the key to repair it would be the most difficult journey of all.